Hey, Rachel, how's it going?
Hey, Lars, it's going well. How about you?
Doing well. Well, I'm excited to be talking about Sun Square Saturn, which, I think is a very profound aspect in any birth chart.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you look at a list of celebrities of who has Sun Square Saturn, you'll see that these are people who are really making a difference in the world and wanting to make a name for themselves, doing really good things. So
Totally.
not 100%, but
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's always variables, but
there's always, yeah.
you're really touching upon why we're doing this series, which is it to take the scare out of the square. And more so than that, a lot of the times, I know when I was first learning about my chart, my squares were described in a way that were like, it was almost fatalistic. It definitely was not empowering. And squares are, by nature, they are motivating you there to empower yourself, right? It is tense, it is through limitation, but be very proud of having this aspect, or recognize that it is helpful at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. And what's great about aspects, natal chart aspects, is that you grow up with these, you have them throughout your lifetime, and so you learn to master the lessons that they represent for you, uh, and often they're most significant, or they play out the strongest before your Saturn return, which happens at 29,
Right.
before your 30th birthday. And then over time, as you're navigating them, as you're working with them, then they become just an integrated into the whole of who you are.
Totally. They don't feel helpful. I think
Yeah.
it's important to say that. When I say they're helpful, Saturn squares, like we've talked about, are tied to like mastery and what you need to learn to master, right?
Mm-hmm.
So eventually they'll be helpful, but they're tough from the get-go.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But nothing to be scared of.
100%. There's no reason to fear it.
And the more you know about it, the more you can work with it consciously in your life, so that when something comes up in your life, and a situation that keeps on showing up, you're dating the same person over and over and again, or having the same
Don't put me on blast.
then you can say like, okay, this is my Saturn square, and I'm gonna work through it. I'm gonna stick
Totally.
there, do my personal growth, and get to the other side.
100%. Should we dive into?
Yeah, let's dive in.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay.
Cool. So that was a great place to start. So like we said, this is taking the scare out of the square.
Uh-huh.
So this is I think that's a really great place to start, because it really is, it may not feel very comfortable, especially pre-Saturn return, but tension is a useful condition for that growth. And Saturn squares, like we discussed, are tied to mastery.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and one thing about the square. So a square aspect is two planets that are 90 degrees away from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think like 90 degrees is a perpendicular angle. And and so you can see like, what 90 degrees, this perpendicular angle, that it's tension. But if we didn't have 90-degree angles, we wouldn't have the structures of our houses. You think about the frame of a house, it's built in 90-degree angles. And so tension leads to stability. It creates a structure for your life. And it also, it's an aspect of your personality that might feel fixed and might feel kind of set in place. But as you work with it, then it becomes eventually something that can be a real asset for you.
100. My mind is blown from that. It's so real. Yeah, it's 100%. It's why now I'm such like a lover of squares, even though I've like railed against squares early in my life. But it's really so true. Like when you're thinking about a structure, which is such a Saturnian word, by the way, thank you. It is built upon those 90-degree angles.
Yeah. Yeah.
I lost all my talking points for this slide from that. You keep going. That's so great.
I think one thing about squares is that we experience them internally, versus oppositions which can often play out in our personal relationships, in projections that we're not able to see about ourselves, that we project out into our lives.
Right.
Whereas a square, it's like your internal voice. It's that thought, that thinking process that plays out over and over again. Often it's subconscious, and so it's not something that you're aware of, but it's something that you're here to refine. It's something that you're here to grow with.
Totally. And then speaking upon that, considering you are the person who taught me progressions, I think it is important to note that it is important for you at home to either work with an astrologer, you know how to use progressions, which is a timing technique, yourself, because you grow and mature. Your square is set in your birth chart, but it grows and it progresses. And so you kind of like age out in a way, or graduate sort of from the square itself. It seems like with at least my like major square that I've described, which is Venus square Saturn, I'm coming upon my Saturn return, and I am now in a sextile and not a square anymore, which is more harmonious.
Yeah. Have you noticed, since you've grown, since it's become become a sextile and not a square, have you noticed shifts in your Venus themes in your life?
Yes, I would say definitely. And not that it's been like easy, right? Like I think that's important to notice. Some of my hardest lessons that have, that I feel like have leveled me up and like have created existing structures that are beneficial for you when it comes to themes of like worth, self-worth, and values, like Venusian themes, came with the sextile that were very tough to learn, but they've only been activating and catalyzing for the better.
Beautiful.
So if you at home don't know what progressions are, definitely important to either consult an astrologer, do some research, because they help you with understanding the timing of that square specifically.
And where you are in the evolutionary process of working through it, gaining mastery over those lessons.
Totally, 100%.
Yeah.
Um,
Anything else you want to add about the square?
I'm ready to go on to Daddy Saturn.
Do it. Let's talk about Saturn.
Awesome. Cool. So Saturn is traditionally, I'm a very modern astrologer, but I think it's important to talk that traditionally it's viewed as a malefic. And that's because you describe Saturn as a teacher. I can't wait for your definition of that. And I like to utilize the terminology that it has the virtues of a leather daddy, very much tied to themes of discipline, structure, restriction, and control. Not comfortable things per se, but things that are required to build that solid foundation.
Right.
I'm a Sag Sun, Sag Moon, Sag Mercury, Sag Mars, Pisces rising. So very Jovian, very Jupiterian, but Jupiter isn't reality, right? Jupiter is very much about the philosophy, the idea, looking to the horizon, where Saturn is kind of gets a bad rep because he's all about like, what's going on right now, right in front of you? What's your reality?
Yeah. Yeah. And we're using reality in the concept of things that are manifested in a physical way. There's like ideas, it's possibilities, and it's a different type of reality. Right. It's the reality of infinite potential. Totally. Saturn is nope. There's not infinite potential. You have to pay your bills. You got to do your taxes. There are rules. There are laws, things like that. One thing I think about Saturn is that Saturn often represents our perceived limitations. Amen. So it's those rules and beliefs and ideas that are hardwired within us from the authority figures in our lives early on in childhood. And those create an egoic structure within which we shape our world. So Saturn's very much involved in hello. Saturn's calling. He's like, hey, wait.
Talking about me?
You got this all wrong. So those ego structures define how much permission we give ourselves to create the lives that we want and manifest our desires. I always like to say, and if you've watched the video before, you know that Saturn for me is a teacher. It is the teacher that wants you to do really well, but wants you to work really hard to get there. And so it can play out as the voice of your inner critic or your inner judge or the inner police officer that rewards you if you do well, but that gives you a lot of punishment if you're messing up.
Totally, 100%. And my first job was actually as a second grade teacher. And I mentioned this in the Venus episode, but we were taught in professional development that the ideal teacher is a no-nonsense nurturer,
Huh.
Which is very Saturnian in concept. Whereas like what you don't want to be is a negative enabler, which is kind of like Jupiter in a way, I think, where, you know, you give instant rewards in order to satiate instead of like having the student go through that hard work and like really study hard, and then, you know, that's when they get the reward. And you know, nothing comes easy with Saturn, but when it comes to mastery, it's not easy to master anything. Isn't it like 10,000 hours or something like that?
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds Saturnian.
Yeah. And so that's why often Saturn represents the energetic blocks, like creative blocks or relationship fears or some of those kinds of things. Saturn can
Stepping on the brake pedal.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's a slowing down and not a complete break.
That's a really good point. And it also makes me think about the fact that Saturn rules bones. And I love that Jessica Lanyadoo, who has a podcast called Ghost of a Podcast, check it out. She uses the word calcification in describing like certain Saturnian aspects. And while calcification, which is the process of like calcium going over bones and stuff, from my understanding, it like creates more rigidity, but it reinforces that bone, right? So that's just like Saturn.
Yeah, and you'll notice that a lot of words that we're using to describe Saturn, we can use to describe a square aspect. And so there's a real relationship between Saturn and square. So structure and limitation and tension, and also the fulfillment of your soul's purpose, the manifestation of your ultimate desires.
Yeah, that's a really, really good, they correlate very tightly, which I think they like reinforce each other in a way, which is why they're the first, Saturn squares are the first part of the series, for sure.
Yeah. And like you said, they're not easy. I know I have a tendency to sugarcoat things. I do
as well.
I do. I've got Jupiter. I've got Mercury trine Jupiter. I can make lemonade out of lemons anytime. But if you have Saturn squares in your chart, natally, you know that they can be challenging.
Right.
But they come with their rewards. With any Saturn transit, with any Saturn aspect, there's always a gift on the other side of a challenge.
Yeah. And, you know, I think just the last point, and then we can talk about this specific square, is like Saturn is tied to consequences. And I said this in the last two videos, and I'll continue to say this, that like a positive consequence is a reward from adhering to the square and putting in that hard work, you know, the 10,000 hours or whatever, you get that positive consequence. Which is a reward. You know, unfortunately with Saturn, it's very much like what you put in is what you get out. So a negative consequence is a consequence. But every single person who has this aspect, you know, you never, like Saturn square is a never give up kind of aspect. So I'm sure you're willing to put in the work.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's glue. Saturn makes you stick to whatever it is that you're going to put your mind to.
I love that. That's so great.
So let's talk about the sun.
Let's go for it. Okay, so the sun is, as everyone knows, their sun sign first, I imagine. And it really, you know, I first describe it as your identity. It isn't sort of what you initially come across as. That's very important to note. That is your rising sign or your ascendant. So very important to note that as well. And then I mostly attribute it to things like vitality from a health perspective. Like I mentioned in the moon video, the moon kind of is like where you were coming from, and then the sun is sort of like where you're headed. It's more future oriented. I also attribute it to the father figure, not necessarily father in the gendered way, and then your shine factor, kind of like how you want to be seen. But what keywords would you like to use?
Yeah, it's so if you think about the sun is the brightest luminary in the heavens. It's like a great big spotlight. And so often, and it's also the primary source of energy for us here on Earth. And
Yep.
so your sun is where you derive your sense of vitality, where you feel like you best express yourself, where you want to step out on stage or want to be seen and want to be recognized. It's the healthy ego.
Right.
So it's the aspect of yourself that separates you from other people, but not in a way that creates separation or division, but in a way that the opposite sign of Leo, which the sun rules, is Aquarius, which is all about wholeness, like being one,
Yep.
community. And so I often find that the sun is where you shine your brightest to contribute to the whole.
Right.
There's the sun rules the heart. And so the sun is often where we find our passion, where we experience joy, where there's a lot of like where we feel alive, the most alive.
Totally. 100%. And I also agree that it's tied to confidence and self-esteem. Mm-hmm. I think it's important, to indicate that the sun is tied to self-esteem. So when you're dealing with a Saturn square to it, it's likely that is taking a hit, and very much it's like paramount, or it's central to the overall themes, the overarching themes of the aspect is really sort of how Saturn not interferes, but intertangles itself with the native's sense of self-esteem.
Yeah. So let's talk about Saturn, or about the square.
Yeah, let's go for it.
I think that's a good segue.
Natural seguer.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we talked about this in the moon square Saturn, but with the sun square Saturn, the sun has a lot to do with your uniqueness and your individuality. And so typically that isn't recognized in childhood, and potentially there is even the need to self-parent or parent other siblings as well. Just like early maturation is a theme of moon and sun square Saturn.
Mm-hmm, and there can even be like taking care, like you said, taking care of siblings, where you feel a sense of responsibility early on.
100%. And with that likely comes the denial of your own self-expression, and leads to sort of self-discipline and self-control. Two things that are really good to have, self-discipline and self-control, but in a healthy modicum. Mm-hmm. For sure. What other major overarching themes would you identify with it?
I find that for people with sun square Saturn, there can be this sense of identifying your personal value with what you do, and not necessarily with who you are. So there's a lot of a sense of, there's a deep desire for recognition. Mm-hmm. There's a deep need to make a difference. There's a sense of not feeling good enough no matter what. And one example I really like for this one is Jane Fonda.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And if you think about it, like I was thinking about this, and Jane Fonda in the 80s had all those workout videos.
Yeah.
And she was like constantly on this, and I think she had an eating disorder too. I think it's like, widely known. But there's this sense of needing to refine yourself, needing to perfect yourself, not ever feeling like you're fully good enough. But one thing about her that's so amazing is that she has made such an incredible difference. Totally. And so she was able to take some of that sun square Saturn tension and do some real good in the world.
Totally. Sun square Saturn people, like we discussed offline, there's really tied to a sense of duty. Yep. There. It's, the desire for recognition is coming not from an unhealthy egoic place. That's more Martian. Since once people hear ego that know astrology, they immediately go to Mars, but this is really like a sense of duty, like the healthy ego for sure. And like Miss Queen last year was getting arrested every weekend,
yes.
Protesting
for climate change. Yeah.
Climate change. And she just posted another video about it. She, is definitely past her second Saturn return. I don't know her exact age. I think it might be 80.
I think she's 80. Yeah.
She might be 80 now, but like very much, this shows a big benefit or a big plus to having this is sort of, you feel this sense of duty, and you can really continue to like serve your fellow man, way, you know, it never stops. She has not retired from
Exactly.
giving up on making the world a better place. And also very much tied to her values and her self-worth. She definitely did do a lot of protesting of war as well in her career. And I think that sense of duty is something to take away as a positive and to channel.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Oprah's another example.
Right. There is a conjunction there too, right? Isn't
she, I can't remember exactly, but I know she has this.
It is Sun Square Saturn,
Sun Square Saturn. But it's that, like you were saying, it's the egoless desire to serve and desire to make a difference. That is an inherent feature within people who have this aspect.
Right. And then I think one thing to like, just like as a mantra that we discussed was sort of to internalize that without failure we cannot evolve, right? Because failure comes across, especially early on, to a Sun Square Saturn person as like a death sentence, or it is just beyond crushing. But you evolve from your failures, right? Failures are platforms for successes. Also recognizing, like Churchill says, that failure is not fatal. It's not a death sentence, and very much you'll only rise stronger from it. So don't take it too hard.
Yeah. I think one thing that's important for Sun Square Saturn people is to find beauty and pleasure, to actually make that part of your spiritual practice. You know, the opposite of that inner critic, that voice, is actually more of like a Venus, the Venus element or Venus aspect of the chart. Anything that you can do to introduce more of that into your life, it can help to balance some of that ongoing self-talk that might not be as uplifting.
100%. And I think just in regards to your, like, their benefit as well, you know, a Sun Square Saturn person is someone who innately knows how to pull themselves up by their britches and can inspire others to do the same, using Jane Fonda as a perfect example of that. Whether it's with her workout videos or through her advocacy work, she really does take what she walks the walk, and then she talks the talk to others to encourage them to do the same.
Definitely. Yeah. So I think she's a really good model of how to turn that around.
Oprah is as well. I mean, she has Super Soul Sunday that she does. She does, you know, national speaking tours, and with her talk show, it was, you know, I mean, she used her own platform in order to inspire others to, you know, overcome their issues.
Right.
And have Tom Cruise jump on her couch. But aside, you know, doesn't apply to this aspect. Well, that was great. Do you have any closing remarks? I think we covered it.
Yeah, we talked about some things that they can do to make the most of it, and yeah, I think that's all I have to say about it.
Perfect. Can let me try to say your contact information.
Okay.
You correct me. It's www.rachellangastrologer.com.
You got it.
Awesome.
And you are?
I am on Instagram and will soon be online. Yeah, stay tuned for my website, but you can find me at liveyourtruth_Lars at Instagram. You're Rachel Lang Astrologer on Instagram and Facebook.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool. So find us. Feel free to comment what you took away from this video as well.
Yeah, and keep coming back. We've got some more. We're going to be doing Pluto next.
Right.
So we'll have
squares and oppositions.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Lars.
Bye.
Bye.